At the end of 1941, the world witnessed the height of German power. The Wehrmacht, previously invincible, had crushed everything in its path, from France to Poland, from Norway to the Balkans. Now, the German colossus marched toward the heart of the Soviet Union. Millions of men, tanks and trucks advanced like a storm of steel across the vast Russian plains. On the frozen fields around Smolensk and Vyazma, German soldiers could already taste victory. They believed, with almost religious confidence, that Moscow would fall within days. Hitler himself had declared, "Just kick the door and the entire Soviet structure will collapse." The motorized columns advanced relentlessly, their engines roaring, the tank tracks crunching on the freshly fallen snow. Every soldier had the same certainty in their tired yet proud eyes. They were about to end the war. Morale was very high. In every makeshift shelter, people talked about Christmas in Berlin. They dreamed of returning home with medals on their chests, of parading through the streets. To applause and waving flags, many wrote letters to their families. "Mom, it won't be long now. Moscow is just around the corner. After that, it's all over." But as they approached the Soviet capital, the optimism began to be mixed with something else. A strange, heavy silence. The roads were becoming seas of frozen mud. Fuel was scarce. And with every kilometer, the convoys encountered burned-out villages, abandoned houses, poisoned wells, all destroyed by the Soviets themselves in their scorched earth policy. There was nothing left to be taken, nothing left to be eaten. Even so, the Germans remained firm, obstinate. The Black Cross flag fluttered in the cold east wind, and Prussian discipline kept them marching. They did not see that they were walking into a huge trap, a trap woven by nature, time, and the enemy. As the thermometer plummeted and the horizon became a white wall, Soviet generals prepared their final stand. Across the lines, Moscow teemed with soldiers, citizens, and factories working day and night. Stalin would not allow his capital to fall. What the Germans didn't know was that, at that very moment, the Russian winter was about to show itself the greatest general of the Soviet Union, and the pride that had brought them here would be the seed of the ruin that would follow. The glory that the soldiers dreamed of for Christmas would soon turn into a nightmare of snow, blood, and despair. Witness the horrors of war like never before. Subscribe now. At first, no one realized that the real enemy was in the air, silent, invisible, and relentless. It was cold, the legendary Russian cold, the same one that had defeated Napoleon more than a century before. In a few days, autumn disappeared, and white hell took over everything. Temperatures plummeted dramatically. The thermometer showed 30 degrees, then 40. The tank engines, proud and powerful, began to groan and stall. Oil froze inside the gears like cement. Rifles jammed. The metal burned to the touch of bare hands, and soldiers who dared touch them without gloves tore off chunks of skin. The roads turned into icy trails. Tires cracked, horses died in droves, and the trucks that could drive belched thick, black smoke, coughing like dying beasts. Each step became a struggle against the biting wind, which screamed in their ears as if mocking them. The cold was unlike anything they had ever known. It was an enemy that gave no respite, which could not be shot or defeated with weapons. At night, the wind roared through the forests, seeping through the cracks in the tents and freezing the very souls of the men. The sound of trees cracking through the ice mingled with the groans of the wounded and the softly murmured prayers. The lightweight uniforms, made for the European summer, offered no protection at all. The thin coats and fine leather boots were useless in the Siberian cold. The soldiers improvised. They wrapped cloth around their feet, used curtains ripped from abandoned houses, and scraps of Soviet blankets stolen from burned villages. Still, it was useless. Every dawn, dozens of bodies were found stiff as stone, sitting, lying down, some still with their eyes open. Soldiers who fell asleep trying to rest and never woke up. Ice formed crystals on eyebrows. Noses bled. Fingers turned black. Doctors cut away chunks of dead flesh. Gangrenous fingers, frozen ears, and they did this without anesthesia, because there was nothing to ease the pain. The laughter, songs and confidence that existed weeks before were completely gone. Now all that remained was the sound of chattering teeth, the crunch of snow under boots, and the distant crack of Soviet rifles in the forests. The cold had become the new front commander, and he didn't give orders. He was just killed. It was against this backdrop of icy terror that the Red Army, fueled by the fury of revenge, prepared to counterattack. Hitler's army, once synonymous with absolute power, now trembled literally before nature and an enemy approaching through the blizzard. The nightmare was just beginning. The Soviet counterattack, December 1941. The Russian winter had already turned the front into a frozen graveyard. And it was precisely at this moment, when the Germans were exhausted, hungry and almost immobile, that the Red Army attacked. At dawn on the 5th, the hills around Moscow began to roar. First came the distant sound, a continuous deep thunder that made the ground vibrate. Then the horizon lit up with red flashes. Thousands of Soviet cannons opened fire at the same time, raining death and destruction down on the frozen German lines. The ground shook. The air was filled with smoke, snow, and blood. When the bombing ceased, they came. Waves of Soviet soldiers, covered in white from head to toe, advanced silently across the snow, like ghosts emerging from the storm. These men were not the same ones the Germans had faced months before. They were hardened, ruthless from Siberia, soldiers who had lived their entire lives in temperatures that made a common man beg for death. They advanced shouting "Rain!" a guttural scream that echoed like human thunder. The Germans, surprised, tried to return fire, but their machine guns jammed, the bullets stuck and their fingers wouldn't obey. And while they fought against the cold, they also fought against an enemy that seemed infinite. Soviet divisions attacked from all sides, from frozen forests, from destroyed villages, even from the skies. Red fighters appeared out of the clouds, unleashing machine gun fire on the retreating convoys. T-34 tanks, slow but tireless, crushed the German positions, their tracks advancing over bodies and debris as if nothing could stop them. The Wehrmacht, which until then had only known advancement, now faced something new, the desperation of retreat. The orders came in confusion, the radios failed, the officers shouted, trying to reorganize the lines. But it was useless. Soviet troops pushed the Germans back, kilometer by kilometer, field by field, with an almost supernatural determination. And what scared the German soldiers most was not just the enemy, but the force of the cold itself combined with Soviet fire. The wounds didn't bleed, they froze. Bodies fell into the snow and lay there motionless, transforming the battlefield into a carpet of shadows and frozen flesh. Soviet officers did not accept prisoners. Any German soldier who tried to surrender was shot on the spot. For the Russians, this wasn't just a war, it was revenge. They remembered the burned villages, the dead civilians, the shot peasants, and now, under General Zhukov's command, revenge had a name. Moscow would be saved, and the invaders would be destroyed. The German columns began to crumble. Men who had once marched proudly in gleaming boots now staggered, covered in ice, dragging wounded comrades along the frozen roads. Their faces were grey, their eyes dull. An army of the undead trying to escape certain death. The Soviet counterattack had turned the world's greatest military force into a band of fugitives. And for the Germans, this would be just the beginning of the long march to hell. Step onto the frozen battlefield. Join us. Subscribe today. The German front was crumbling. The orders coming from Berlin were confusing, disconnected from reality. Hitler shouted in his headquarters that no one should retreat a single step. But there, on the icy Russian plains, it was impossible to obey. The Wehrmacht no longer fought to win, it fought only to survive. The retreat began chaotically. Snow-covered roads were filled with endless columns of exhausted men, broken-down trucks, and dead horses. The air smelled of burning oil, blood, and frozen flesh. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, dragging snowflakes over the scattered bodies. The soldiers marched with empty eyes, holding their weapons like walking sticks, tripping over their own dead. The landscape was an endless white desert. No trees, no shelter, no sound of life. Only the distant rumble of Soviet artillery, like a drum of death that pursued them. The convoys moved slowly, stopping every few kilometers to pick up the injured and repair frozen vehicles. But many were simply left behind. Men without strength were pushed into the snow, abandoned, quickly covered by a white layer that swallowed them without mercy. The officers tried to maintain order, but the desperation was absolute. Some soldiers burned their own documents and insignia, fearing they would become prisoners. Others destroyed their weapons to avoid capture by the Russians. The few fires lit during the night became small circles of hope and also of horror. Men slept near the fire and never woke up. The cold silently overcame them, transforming them into ice statues sitting around the flames. Soviet attacks were incessant. Artillery followed closely, bombarding escape routes. Guerrillas hiding in the forests attacked isolated convoys, cut supply lines, and looted what remained. The Germans were hunted relentlessly, pursued like wounded animals. Amidst the desperate march, there were scenes that seemed to come straight from hell. Carts full of wounded being left behind, soldiers crawling on the ice with frozen feet, moaning softly so as not to attract the Russians. Wild dogs prowled around the dead. The ground, once hard and dry, was now covered with bodies. Germans and Soviets mixed together, indistinguishable, all swallowed by the same murderous cold, and as the army trudged westward, each step seemed heavier, more painful. The men knew they were running away, and it gnawed at their souls. The Wehrmacht, once the symbol of power and discipline, now dissolved into a sea of fear and despair. The withdrawal was not a military maneuver. It was a human collapse. Every day hundreds went missing, dead, frozen, or simply lost in the snow. And in the distance, the roar of Soviet forces grew like a monster feeding on enemy suffering. German pride, the one that had brought them to the gates of Moscow, was gone. All that remained was the primitive instinct to keep walking. Walk as far as your legs could take you. Walk until the cold decided who would live and who would be devoured by the Russian winter. Survive the nightmare of history, subscribe, and watch more. What remained of the German army was no longer an army. It was a throng of staggering spectres, human shadows dragging rifles and empty backpacks in the icy Russian wind. Men who had once marched proudly under the eagle's banner now fought only for a last drink of water, a crust of hardened bread, a thread of life. The cold no longer hurt. It had passed the point of pain. It was as if the body had forgotten what it was like to feel warm. Their faces were white, bluish, with cracked lips and dried blood in their nostrils. Frozen beards mixed with the snow and formed ice masks. When they spoke, the air came out, like thick smoke. When they coughed, dark blood stained the surrounding snow. At night the temperature dropped even further, and the cold seemed entered through the bones. Soldiers dug holes in the snow to try to sleep, huddled together like frightened animals. They used the bodies of their dead companions as barriers against the wind. It was a desperate gesture, but a necessary one, because there, any mistake, any extra minute exposed to the wind was a death sentence. Some shouted the names of missing friends. Others laughed alone, raving, talking to shadows. The cold not only killed the body, he drove the mind crazy. And then came the mornings. As the pale sun rose over the horizon, officers passed by counting the living, and almost always the number dwindled. Many had frozen in their sleep, their eyes still open, their hands gripping their weapons, their faces serene, as if they had accepted their fate. The companions had no time to bury them. All you had to do was push the bodies to the side of the road. Within minutes, the wind and snow did the job, covering them completely. The survivors walked among these white tombs, knowing that perhaps they would be next. The smell of death permeated everything: the breath, the clothes, the air. Hunger no longer hurt, because the empty stomach had long since given up complaining. Some began to eat dirty snow, others chewed on boot leather or dry leaves plucked from frozen branches. And yet they continued. A heavy silence dominated the column. There was no more music, no more war songs, no more hope, just the sound of boots scuffing in the snow and the distant clink of some rifle stuck in the ice. The pride of the Wehrmacht had died there, buried under the Russian snow. Many began to pray, even those who had never believed in God. Others stared blankly at the sky, as if waiting for something, anything, to come and take them away. But there were no angels on the front, only hungry crows and the distant roar of Soviet artillery, reminding everyone that the enemy was still close. Those men no longer fought for Hitler nor for Germany. They fought against death itself. And for many, this fight was already lost. The army that had marched arrogantly across Europe now crawled, broken, faithless and soulless. Pride had turned to despair, and despair, internal silence. Supply line, chaos. The supply line, the heart of any army, had simply collapsed. What was once an efficient network of trains, trucks and depots was now a maze of frozen destruction. Snow-covered tracks, idled locomotives, abandoned cars. The steel was too cold to even touch. The engines didn't work, the fuel was gone, and the food was simply gone. The rearguard troops, who were supposed to feed and supply the front, were as lost as the frontline soldiers. The convoys tried to move along the icy roads, but the tires cracked, the tank tracks froze, and the overloaded trucks overturned in the ditches, forming machine cemeteries covered by snow. The road that had once been the path of conquest was now the path of death. The soldiers marched hungry, their stomachs empty for days. The canned food had long since run out. Bread, when it existed, was hard as a rock. You had to break it with the butt of a bayonet. Many began to eat dead horses, cutting the frozen meat with dull knives, heating it over small fires made from pieces of ammunition boxes. Others boiled leather from boots, belts and backpacks, hoping to extract some flavor, some energy. There were reports of soldiers eating frozen Soviet rations found in destroyed shelters, even human flesh when desperation reached its limit. Hunger does not choose morals or country. She simply devours reason. The ammunition trains were lost, scattered, and communication between the divisions had disappeared. The radios didn't work. The batteries froze within minutes. Messengers sent on horseback never returned. Some were swallowed up by the blizzard, others killed by Soviet patrols or armed civilians. Yes, even the Russian peasants had become mortal enemies, attacking isolated soldiers with axes, scythes, anything they could wield. The chaos was total. Commandless men wandered the tundra like zombies, following footprints in the snow, unsure whether they were heading west or back to the front. The disorganization was so great that entire units simply disappeared, wiped off the map. When the generals tried to reorganize the lines, they realized that the divisions that existed on paper already no longer existed in reality. Meanwhile, the Red Army, with its short lines and local supply, received ammunition, food and reinforcements. The Russians seemed unbreakable, while the Germans languished. The cold, hunger and exhaustion were doing what no weapon had been able to do: break Hitler's army. In the midst of this madness, some soldiers still tried to maintain a semblance of order. They marched in silence, with the rifle slung over their shoulder and their gaze lost. Others no longer cared. They threw away their weapons, tore off their badges, and walked westward, hands in their pockets, shoulders hunched, aimless. The supply line, that vital artery of the Wehrmacht, had become an open wound, bleeding men, vehicles, and hope. At every kilometer, the trail of retreat was marked by dead horses, burned tanks, and piles of frozen corpses. War, which had once seemed like mechanized glory, was now just man's struggle against cold, hunger, and insanity itself. The front lines await you. Join our journey, hit subscribe. The Soviet counteroffensive, the roar of the Red Winter and the frozen hell. By late 1941, the German Wehrmacht, after months of relentless advance across the Russian wilderness, found itself at the gates of Moscow. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June of that year, had pushed back Soviet forces in a series of crushing victories, and the capital seemed within reach. Belief in victory was almost palpable among the exhausted but comical shift, but a cataclysmic turnaround. The Wehrmacht, stretched to the limit of its supply lines and unprepared for the extreme cold, saw its triumphant march turn into an icy nightmare. The oppressive silence of the steppe, punctuated only by the biting wind, was suddenly shattered by a terrifying sound. The roar of the Red Army, which many had given up for annihilation, resurfacing with renewed fury and a capacity for organization that surprised even the most skeptical. Under the iron leadership of Joseph Stalin, who had remained in Moscow and sworn to defend the capital at all costs, Soviet forces orchestrated a bold strategic move, conceived and executed by General Georgy Zhukov. Soviet intelligence, through agents like Richard Sorge in Tokyo, confirmed that Japan would not attack Siberia, allowing entire Red Army divisions previously stationed in the Far East to be discreetly redeployed to the Western Front. This massive transfer, carried out under the strictest secrecy and with remarkable logistical efficiency, brought to the battlefield Siberian soldiers, men and women hardened by brutal winters, acclimated to temperatures that would have made most Europeans succumb. Outfitted in white camouflage coats, thick gloves, and felt boots, Valenki, they moved on skis, nearly invisible in the snowy landscape, becoming silent ghosts of war, capable of operating in conditions that paralyzed the enemy. At dawn on December 5, 1941, all hell broke loose. A heavy artillery barrage thundered over the frozen German positions, but the most terrifying sound came from the Stalin organs. Truck-mounted Katyusha multiple rocket launchers unleashed a hail of shells that tore through the sky with a deafening howl before raining down on enemy lines, transforming entire areas into a hell of fire and shrapnel. The psychological impact of these attacks was devastating, breaking German morale even before direct contact. The fearsome T-34 tanks, with their sloped armor and powerful guns, advanced like untamed beasts, crushing the ice beneath their tracks and the bodies of those unable to escape. Their superiority in the snowy terrain was undeniable, in contrast to the German tanks, which suffered from limited mobility. Behind them, endless waves of Soviet infantry, armed with PPSH-41 submachine guns and Mosin Nagant rifles, advanced en masse, shouting, "Hurrah!" A guttural cry that echoed in the souls of the German soldiers, sounding like an omen of their own death. Soviet resolve was unshakable. They attacked with a ferocity bordering on fanaticism, even wounded, even burned, even on the brink of death, driven by the defense of their homeland and ideology. Frozen battlefields, endless courage. Subscribe and witness it all. The Wehrmacht's positions, already weakened by cold and fatigue, began to crumble under the overwhelming impact. Men who months earlier had marched proudly across Europe now fled in disarray, disoriented, stumbling through the bloody snow. Many tried to fight back, but the cold paralyzed their weapons. Machine gun oil froze, rifle mechanisms jammed, and grenades often froze in their hands before being thrown. German logistics, designed for mobile warfare in temperate climates, failed miserably in the Russian winter, with roads frozen and railways inadequate for transporting essential supplies. German generals like Guderian and Halder desperately tried to organize a cohesive defense, but it was futile. The enemy seemed to surge from every direction in flanking, Attacks and rapid encirclements exploiting gaps in the German lines. Entire platoons were cut off and decimated, and the road to Moscow, which should have been the path to victory, became a death row. Once unshakable morale sank into ice and despair, and the spectre of defeat became a terrifying reality. It was in that bloody December that the Wehrmacht realized a brutal truth. They were fighting not just an army, but an entire nation and a land that refused to be subjugated. Russia, with its vastness, its relentless winter, and the resilience of its people, had awakened, and it cried out for revenge, transforming the dream of a swift victory into a nightmare of epic proportions. Frozen hell. When the earth turned against men and the German strategy failed, the winter of 1941-1942 arrived not as a season, but as a silent killer, without mercy, without emotion, only the relentless weight of nature turned against humanity. The thermometer plunged to -40 degrees, and in some places, such as Siberia, as low as 60. The air seemed to freeze, and sound became rarefied, creating an atmosphere of unreality and terror. What remained of the once proud Wehrmacht marched on roads covered in ice and deep snow, under biting winds that tore at skin like sheets of glass. Every step was a grueling struggle for survival, a constant battle against hypothermia, exhaustion, and hopelessness. The engines of panzer tanks, once symbols of German might, now died on the frozen plains. Lubricating oil hardened into a solid paste, diesel fuel turned to gel, and gun mechanisms seized, rendering most vehicles inoperable. The lack of antifreeze and low-temperature lubricants revealed a glaring flaw in German planning, which severely underestimated the conditions of the Russian winter. Soldiers, desperate for warmth, tried to light fires with whatever they could find, looted books, maps, furniture from abandoned houses, and even scraps of their own uniforms. But the bitter cold seemed to mock their efforts. The flames, weak and flickering, were swallowed by the biting wind and the incessant snow, offering little relief and serving only to reveal their positions to the enemy. The summer clothing with which the Germans had begun the campaign no longer protected them at all. Exposed skin suffered from severe frostbite, leading to mass amputations and incapacitating thousands of soldiers. Men stuffed newspapers, straw, rags, and any scrap of fabric between the layers of their tattered uniforms in a vain attempt to outwit the frost. Boots froze to their feet, causing gangrene. Fingers, noses, and ears fell off silently, a terrible testament to the ravages of the cold. Each morning revealed a new field of dead, soldiers frozen in the position they had slept in, still clutching their Mauser rifles, their eyes open and empty, covered by a thin layer of snow like a white shroud. The rate of casualties from frostbite and cold-related illnesses far exceeded combat. Casualties, decimating entire divisions without a single shot being fired. And the worst enemy wasn't just the cold or the Soviets, it was the desperation that over the ice and snow, attacking from where least expected. They were shadows emerging from the icy mist, firing their weapons, shouting their war cries, and disappearing again into the snow-covered forests, leaving behind only devastation. Each attack was swift, precise, and deadly, capitalizing on their knowledge of the terrain, superior winter equipment, and familiarity with guerrilla tactics. Soviet skier units, in particular, were masters at flanking and encircling German positions, which became isolated islands in the frozen wasteland. The German army, which just months earlier had marched triumphantly across vast stretches of the Soviet Union, was now a mass of broken men, physically and psychologically. The pride that had driven them melted along with the frozen tears on their faces. The war they believed they could dominate and win quickly now devoured them, transforming the Russian battlefield into a vast tomb of ice, iron, and broken dreams. Hitler's order to hold your ground at all costs, forbidding any tactical retreat, only worsened the catastrophe. Lacking the flexibility to Withdraw to defensible positions. Entire divisions were left to freeze and die, trapped in pockets of futile resistance that were systematically annihilated by the red tide. The retreat, when finally authorized in some sectors, was chaotic and desperate, more of a flight than a military maneuver. The Wehrmacht was no longer on the offensive, was fighting for its very survival against two implacable enemies, the Soviet soldier and the Russian winter, which together forced the first major defeat of the Blitzkrieg and changed the course of World War II. The deadly retreat, the collapse of the German front. The German withdrawal ceased to be a simple military maneuver and turned into a true nightmare of blood, ice and despair. The columns of soldiers advanced slowly, trudging along the snow-covered roads where every kilometer cost lives. Men stumbled over the bodies of frozen comrades, some unaware, others too strong to cry. Logistics had disappeared. Out of fuel, food and ammunition, each unit disintegrated into small groups of survivors. Trucks overturned in frozen ditches, horses died, tanks stalled, and what remained of the Wehrmacht's glory now shuffled like specters. The relentless Red Army pressed from all sides. Snipers hidden in the forests picked off any isolated soldier. Heavy artillery fired on columns that couldn't move, creating craters of frozen death. Every German movement was accompanied by screams of pain, explosions, and the crack of wood and metal splintering. Under the weight of snow and ice, chaos spread quickly. Officers tried to reorganize their units, but were ignored by the men's desperation, many already devoid of hope. Soldiers left the wounded behind, throwing them into the snow, knowing there would be no rescue. Some went mad, screaming in the storm. Others just walked in silence, their eyes vacant, like the living dead. The cold continued to claim lives without discrimination. Each night was a brutal test. Those who tried to sleep often never woke. There was the icy sound of snow crunching under the weight of bodies, the cracking of frozen bones, the howling of the wind carrying distant screams. It was an army-reduced tow mass of ghosts, fleeing from an enemy that now included nature itself. The German pride that had carried them to the gates of Moscow had been crushed. The retreat became not just a fight against the Red Army, but against hunger, cold, and insanity itself. Every kilometer traveled was marked by blood, bodies, and silent death, while the survivors knew intimately that many would never see Germany again. The Wehrmacht, which had once ruled Europe with an iron fist, was now slowly dissolving beneath the Russian snow, dragging itself towards a fate that seemed inevitable. Lethal and cruel, the deadly retreat, the collapse of the German front. The German retreat from the Eastern Front, in the depths of the winter of 1941-1942, transcended mere military maneuver and metamorphosed into a veritable nightmare of blood, ice, and despair, an ordeal that would leave indelible scars on the Wehrmacht's memory. The columns of soldiers, once the proud vanguard of the Blitzkrieg, now trudged slowly along snow and ice-covered roads, where each kilometer traveled was not merely a distance, but a toll paid in lives. Men stumbled over the bodies of frozen comrades, some in a state of exhaustion and torpor so profound they barely grasped the tragedy, while others, still possessing a shred of humanity, were too drained of strength to weep, their eyes fixed on a dim horizon of survival, the dismantling of logistics and the disintegration of order. The intricate and efficient German logistical machinery that had sustained the lightning advances across Europe had completely disappeared, swallowed up by the vastness and cold of Russia. Without fuel for their vehicles, food for their men, or ammunition for their weapons, each unit began to disintegrate into small, desperate groups of survivors. Trucks, once laden with vital supplies, tumbled into frozen ditches, their engines petrified by the extreme cold and the oil as thick as molasses. Horses, the last bastions of transportation in many units, died of exhaustion and starvation, their bloated, stiff bodies serving as macabre landmarks along the way. Panzer tanks, symbols of German might, stalled irretrievably, their tracks stuck in the ice and snow, their guns silenced, becoming iron monuments to defeat. What remained of the Wehrmacht's glory now crawled like starving, frozen spectres, a pale shadow of its glorious past. The relentless pursuit of the enemy and the hostility of nature. The Red Army, relentless and adapted to the environment, pressed from all sides, turning the retreat into a brutal hunt. Soviet snipers, camouflaged in the dense, snow-covered pine forests, picked off any isolated soldier who strayed from the main column, turning every tree into a potential threat. Heavy artillery, including the fearsome Katyushas, fired on the German columns, which, paralyzed by the snow and lack of vehicles, could not move quickly enough, creating craters of frozen death and spreading panic. Every German movement was accompanied by screams of pain, explosions echoing across the icy landscape, and the ominous crack of wood and metal splintering under the weight of snow and ice, a macabre chorus of annihilation. Chaos spread quickly, eroding discipline and hierarchy. Officers, many as desperate as their men, tried to reorganize the units, but their commands were ignored by the desperation and indifference of the soldiers, many already devoid of any hope of salvation. Military cohesion disintegrated, giving way to an individual struggle for survival. Soldiers, hardened by the brutality of war and the imminence of death, left the wounded behind, throwing them into the snow to die of cold, knowing there would be no rescue, no mercy. Some, pushed to the limit of human endurance, went mad, screaming incoherently amid the blizzard and howling wind, while others simply walked in silence, their eyes blank and staring, like the living dead dragging themselves toward an inevitable fate. The cold as a general and the silent death. The cold, the true general of the Red Army, continued to reap lives without discrimination, an invisible and omnipresent force. Each night was a brutal test of endurance. Those who tried to sleep, seeking a brief refuge from the agony, often never woke, their bodies found frozen the next morning. There was the icy, piercing sound of snow crunching under the weight of bodies, the cracking of frozen bones, the ghostly howl of the wind carrying distant screams of agony and despair. It was an army reduced to a mass of ghosts, fleeing from an enemy that now included nature itself, implacable and indifferent to human suffering. German pride, which had driven them to the gates of Moscow with the promise of a swift and decisive victory, had been crushed beneath the Siberian boots and the weight of the Russian winter. The retreat became not just a fight against the Red Army, but against excruciating hunger, paralyzing cold, and the very insanity that lurked in every shadow. Every kilometer traveled was marked by blood, bodies, and silent anonymous death, while the few survivors knew intimately that many would never see Germany again, their hopes and dreams buried in the snow of the Russian steppe. The Wehrmacht, which had once ruled Europe with an iron fist, now slowly dissolved beneath the Russian snow, dragging itself toward a fate that seemed inevitably lethal and cruel, a testament to the arrogance and underestimation of an enemy and an environment that had proved invincible. Hitler's orders: no step back, the doctrine of destruction. In the turmoil of the Russian winter of 1941, as the Wehrmacht disintegrated under the impact of the Soviet counteroffensive and the paralyzing cold, a distant but implacable voice echoed from Berlin, sealing the fate of thousands of German soldiers. Adolf Hitler, the Führer and commander-in-chief of the army, even in the face of alarming reports of the imminent collapse of the Eastern Front, refused to give an inch of ground. For him, iron discipline and unquestioning obedience were the pillars that would sustain the army, even when the reality on the battlefield belied every one of his dogmas. His orders were categorical and brutal: not a single step back, Not a single soldier must retreat. Inflexible. Ideology and strategic blindness. Hitler's mind was trapped in an ideology of unbreakable will, where retreat was synonymous with moral weakness, shame, and ultimately betrayal of the Reich's cause. He firmly believed that persistence, even in the face of the most adverse conditions, would ultimately break enemy resistance. For Hitler, Germany's history, and especially its defeat in World War I, had been marked by retreats and internal betrayals. He was determined not to repeat what he saw as the mistakes of the past. Thus, tactical flexibility, essential in any military campaign, was sacrificed in the name of an ideological rigidity that would prove suicidal. Every misstep, every hesitation to allow a strategic retreat to more defensible positions was a death sentence for the men on the frozen front, who found themselves trapped between Soviet fury and the intransigence of their own leader. The brutal enforcement of order on the battlefield, in the makeshift barracks, the freezing tents, and the command posts along the front line, Hitler's orders were issued with increasing brutality. Officers, under threat of severe punishment, shouted, bayoneted exhausted soldiers who tried to flee the front, and threatened summary military tribunals and executions for desertion. Blind obedience, once a trump card of the German war machine, now became a deadly burden. Exhausted, wounded, starving and freezing men were forced to continue marching forward or hold indefensible positions, as the Red Army closed in mercilessly, exploiting every vulnerability. German units, already decimated, attempted to reorganize, only to be immediately thrown back into the snow and Soviet fire in futile counterattacks. Tanks, once the terror of Europe, were irreparably stuck, their parts frozen and their engines inoperable. Heavy artillery, which could have provided cover, was left behind, abandoned in the mud and snow due to a lack of fuel or transportation. Every attempt to advance or hold a position seemed futile, resulting only in more casualties and the loss of valuable equipment. Some more pragmatic officers, such as General Heinz Guderian, attempted to negotiate small tactical retreats to save what remained of their troops and equipment, but were summarily ignored, reprimanded, or in extreme cases, punished and removed from their commands for disobedience. Despair and moral disintegration. Meanwhile, soldiers on the front lines, immersed in the brutal realities of war and winter, realized that the order not to retreat was not only absurd, it was murderous. They saw comrades collapse from the cold, their bodies freezing within hours, or be cut down by Soviet snipers and artillery, yet they were still forced to advance or remain in meaningless positions. Desperation mixed with anger and frustration. Reports of men openly arguing with their superiors, infighting, and even cases of soldiers shooting their own officers to escape the ordeal began to emerge, highlighting the complete disintegration of morale and discipline. Loyalty to the Führer and the Reich was being replaced by a primitive instinct for survival, and solidarity among comrades often overrode orders from above. The result of such intransigence was a broken, scattered and uncoordinated army. The glory that had brought them to the gates of Moscow had vanished, replaced by a grim reality of defeat and suffering. Pride turned to pure fear, and each day was a desperate struggle not only against the Soviet enemy, but also against the excruciating cold, constant hunger, and the madness lurking in the minds of the men. Hitler's order, a desperate attempt to control the war machine he himself had set in motion, but which now spun out of his control, only accelerated the Wehrmacht's collapse, turning the retreat into a living hell across the frozen Russian land. The doctrine of no step back ensured that the price of ideological stubbornness was paid with the blood and lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, marking the beginning of the end of German invincibility in the East. Burning their own vehicles, the mechanized holocaust of the German retreat, with the Soviet advance ever closer and the frozen roads turned into death traps. blocked by impassable snow, treacherous ice, and the stiff bodies of comrades and enemies alike, the German soldiers faced one of the most desperate and symbolic decisions of their retreat: abandon or destroy their own vehicles. This choice, forced by the brutality of winter and the relentlessness of the enemy, became a mechanized holocaust, a bitter sacrifice of everything that represented the Wehrmacht's power and efficiency. The dilemma of destruction and the uselessness of technology. Trucks, tanks and artillery pieces, which in other circumstances would have been crucial for saving lives, transporting the wounded and maintaining frontline cohesion, became useless obstacles. Stuck in deep snow, their engines petrified by the extreme cold and lack of fuel, or simply broken down by mechanical failures impossible to repair in the conditions at the front, these vehicles impeded the withdrawal of troops and the transport of the few remaining supplies. Each immobilized machine was a bottleneck, a choke point that condemned more men to the cold and the Soviet advance. German technology, once a source of pride and the foundation of the Blitzkrieg, proved powerless and fragile in the face of the vastness and the Russian winter. Faced with imminent capture by the Red Army and ordered not to leave any war material intact in enemy hands, soldiers were forced to set fire to their own tanks, trucks, armored personnel carriers, and even officers' cars. It was an act of desperation and obedience, a desecration of the instruments of their own glory. The fire, fueled by gasoline, kerosene, or any available flammable material, sent flames mingling with dense black smoke, spiraling upward against the oppressive grey sky of the steppe. An atmosphere of frozen apocalypse was created, where flames danced over twisted metal carcasses, briefly illuminating the darkness of defeat. False heat and the brutal consequences. However, the heat generated by these improvised fires was brief and illusory, useless in the face of the extreme cold that penetrated to the marrow of the bones. Paradoxically, many who attempted to destroy the vehicles by getting too close to exploding ammunition or burning tanks suffered severe burns to their hands and faces, or were struck by shrapnel of frozen metal flying in all directions. The danger of being killed by one's own equipment was as real as that of being shot down by the enemy or succumbing to the cold. Destruction was a double-edged sword, a necessary act that exacted its own price in suffering. The sight along the retreat routes was terrifying and desolate. Miles and miles of partially destroyed tanks, their turrets overturned, their wheels and tracks twisted, and the dark smoke rising incessantly into an indifferent sky. Around these smouldering carcasses, German soldiers marched in a ghostly procession, staggering and dragging themselves, trying to carry what few supplies remained: a rifle, a piece of frozen bread, a torn blanket. Meanwhile, comrades fell dead from cold or hunger, or were cut down by Soviet attacks that came out of nowhere. The horses, unmounted and exhausted, cried and neighed in pain and exhaustion, their bodies slowly being swallowed by the snow, which would soon cover them in a cold white shroud, the symbol of defeat and the loss of pride. Each burned vehicle was more than a material loss. It was a choice between life and death, a cruel reminder of what had been so hard won and what was being irretrievably lost. The German soldiers, who had once prided themselves on their superior technology and impeccable discipline, now lived in the cruelest and most humiliating reality. Their very equipment, a symbol of their power and invincibility, had become a mortal burden, an obstacle to be overcome or destroyed. The burning of the vehicles was an act of forced dispossession, a renunciation of their identity as a modern mechanized army. And as the fire consumed the metal and oil, the snow continued to fall, covering everything with its merciless white blanket. The smell of burning metal mingled with the pungent odor of congealed blood, smoke, and human flesh, creating a scene that resembled an apocalyptic cemetery more than a battlefield. German pride, once so inflated, had turned to ash, and the Wehrmacht, reduced to shadows of men, desperately tried to survive, dragging itself away from the hell they themselves had helped create, but which now consumed them. The burning of the vehicles was not just a scorched earth tactic. It was the epitaph of Operation Barbarossa, a silent testament to the failure of a grand ambition and the relentless victory of the Russian winter. The horror of ambushes, invisible death in the Russian vastness, as the Wehrmacht, once the spearhead of the German war machine, advanced, or more accurately tried to crawl, westward, fleeing the frozen hell of Moscow. The incessant blizzard and dense Russian forests transformed into a maze of unseen dangers. With each step, the landscape became more hostile, and the frigid air carried not only the howling of the wind, but also the constant threat of an enemy that seemed to rise from the very ground. Soviet soldiers, often partisans and Red Army, reconnaissance units, moving silently like hungry wolves, attacked from all sides, turning every German step into a possible and imminent death sentence. The brutal routine of ambushes and the disintegration of units. The ambushes, once isolated incidents, became a brutal and incessant routine. Small groups of Germans, desperate for food, fuel, or simply a moment of relief from the cold, who separated from the main column, were immediately surrounded and massacred. The sound of gunfire, dry and sharp in the frozen air, came from snow-covered trees, from ditches hidden under the white blanket, and from abandoned villages that became snipers' nests. Before the survivors could even react or locate the source of the attack, comrades were cut down, their bodies falling into the snow, forming mounds of shadow and white that would soon be covered by the merciless blanket of winter. With each ambush, the cohesion of the German units disintegrated a little further, and mutual trust was eroded. By panic and the certainty that help would not come, Soviet snipers, masters of camouflage and terrain knowledge, exploited every detail of the landscape to their advantage. They knew the hidden trails that wound through the forests, the frozen rivers that served as shortcuts or traps, and the depressions in the ground that offered perfect cover. With a single, precise and surgical shot, they could take down an officer, paralyzing command and decision-making, or hit entire groups of soldiers, spreading panic and disorganization that quickly spread through the retreating columns. The war of attrition transformed into a war of nerves, where the invisible threat was as devastating as a direct attack, the cold as the enemy's ally and nature's traps. The cold, an already relentless enemy, spared no one. But the enemy's incessant action made the situation even more unbearable. Frozen, hungry and exhausted men were easy targets, their reactions slow and their bodies weakened. Those trying to escape the ambushes often fell into natural traps that blended into the landscape, ditches hidden under layers of snow, thinly frozen rivers that broke under the weight of boots and tanks, burying the unwary alive in their icy waters. Nature, already a formidable adversary, seemed to conspire with the Soviets, transforming the terrain into a minefield of hidden dangers. Some German soldiers, in a final act of desperation and bravery, tried to fight back, firing machine guns or throwing improvised grenades toward the invisible attackers. But the effect was minimal, almost symbolic. Each explosion only increased the despair and the sense of helplessness. Black smoke mixed with the snow, further obscuring vision, and the sounds of death, screams, gunshots, shrapnel, echoed even louder in the silent vastness. The feeling was of an endless nightmare, where every step could be the last, every breath the final, and hope faded with each passing minute. Soviet revenge, and the end of an illusion. These ambushes were not merely tactical military attacks. They were instruments of Soviet revenge, brutal retribution for the horrors inflicted on the Soviet Union. Every dead German soldier reminded them of the looted villages, the murdered civilians, the destroyed cities, and the scorched earth. The fury of the Soviet people, channeled through their soldiers and partisans, was palpable, and the brutality of war became a vicious cycle of retaliation. And as the death toll rose exponentially, The Wehrmacht increasingly became a shadow of the army that had once marched proudly across Europe, its invincibility shattered by the Russian reality. The horror was constant, invisible, relentless, a ghostly presence that haunted every mile of the retreat. Each day, the snow swallowed more soldiers, more corpses, and more hope, transforming the vast Russian plain into a frozen graveyard. German pride and arrogance had crumbled, replaced by a primordial terror, and the Wehrmacht, once the most feared force in Europe, was now on the run, disorganized, and at the mercy of an enemy who knew no mercy and a nature that was unforgiving. The ambushes were a constant reminder that, in Russia, war was fought on multiple fronts, and death could come from any direction, at any moment. The despair of the troops. The German retreat was now beyond any description of discipline or strategy. The soldiers, exhausted and hungry, walked like human shadows trudging through the snow, each step heavier than the last. Food supplies had been depleted for days, fuel was almost non-existent, and the absolute cold froze what little blood still flowed in his veins. Desperation took many forms. Some soldiers attacked their comrades for scraps of food. Others simply sat in the snow, staring into the void, unable to move, aware that there was no way out. The fear of capture by the Soviets was almost unbearable, but the fear of death from the cold was even greater. Men who had once marched with pride now wept softly, murmuring forgotten prayers or the names of family they would never see again. The sound of death was constant. The icy wind dragged frozen bodies that fell from exhaustion or injury. Every Soviet machine gun burst seemed to pierce the hearts of those who listened. Many soldiers went mad, raving with visions of home, food, warmth, things that no longer existed. The divisions were unrecognizable. Small groups split off, trying to find a safe path, but often disappeared. Without a trace. Cold, hunger, and fear had dissolved all organization and courage. The retreat was not just a military maneuver, it was a march of the condemned, an endless journey through white hell. The officers, helpless, shouted orders that no one could carry out. Every command was ignored, every attempt at reorganization failed in the face of the devastating power of the snow, the enemy, and the despair that consumed the men. It was the end of the Wehrmacht as an invincible army. Those troops that once marched proudly across Europe were now just survivors, fighting to hold on to their lives while the enemy and winter decided who deserved to live. The horror of human losses. As the Wehrmacht crept across Russian territory, counting the lives lost became impossible. The casualties weren't just numbers in the reports, they were landscapes of frozen corpses and absolute despair. Trucks stuck in the snow were surrounded by dead soldiers, some still clutching their weapons, eyes open, frozen in the last moment of fighting. The cold spared no one. Men dropped dead from exhaustion, freezing, or starvation. The thinly frozen rivers became death traps. Soldiers slipped and were swallowed by the ice, disappearing without a trace. Horses died in rows, turning entire roads into scenes of silent death, and each corpse left behind wasn't just a body. It was a grim warning to the survivors, reminding them of their own impending mortality. Diseases began to spread rapidly. Wounds that could normally be treated became fatal in the extreme cold. Gangrene, pneumonia, and advanced frostbite turned minor wounds into death sentences. Many soldiers died slowly, in silent agony, buried in the snow, or abandoned by comrades unable to carry anyone else. The loss of life also extended to morale. With each death, courage waned. With each body left behind, hope waned. The army that once marched with pride and discipline now became a fragmented shadow of men surviving only by instinct, dragging themselves through the cold, hunger, and fear. And so, reports from the Soviet front turned into horror legends, stories of soldiers who disappeared into the endless white, bodies piled in the snow, riders frozen on dead horses, tanks abandoned and burned. a war in which nature and the human enemy conspired to utterly destroy what remained of the German army. The Wehrmacht no longer fought, only resisted, and endurance was measured in daily survival, kilometre by kilometre, body by body. The end of the nightmare, the withdrawal. Completed after weeks of endless marching, deadly cold and incessant attacks, the German retreat finally reached the limits of the occupied territory. But there was no victory, there was no glory. Only a heavy silence, broken by the crunch of snow under boots and wrecked vehicles. What had come to the west were shadows of men who had once marched with pride, transformed into exhausted and hungry spectres, many wounded or frozen, carrying only memories of lost comrades and bodies left behind. The columns were scattered, burned, and abandoned vehicles dotted the road like monuments to destruction. The cold was still biting, but now the danger came less from the ice and more from echo of traumatic memories of each survivor. The Red Army, for its part, had accomplished its mission. Moscow was saved, the German advance halted, and winter had shown its most brutal face. A ruthless ally that, together with Soviet resistance, had destroyed the pride and strength of one of the most powerful armies in Europe. For the German soldiers, each final step of the retreat was marked by silence, mourning, and despair. The survivors carried with them not only physical wounds, but a deep and silent pain, remembering that war was not just a confrontation between armies, but also a relentless test of humanity itself in the face of cold, hunger, and death. And so, what began as a triumphant march towards Moscow ended in a crossing of white hell, leaving a terrifying lesson. Not even human power is a match for the nature, determination, and vengeance of a nation that refuses to be defeated. The nightmare of the German retreat through Russia was over, but its scars would remain forever. In the snowfields, in the frozen bodies, and in the hearts of the survivors who would never forget the horror of that winter.